Thank you. STAT doesn't actually include statistics in its acronym, but it is very inclusive of statistical principles, but also of more things that are necessary in methods for test and analysis. So this case study is about building bridges with other programs when you're helping a program from the outside, as we often are as STAT experts. That's the current stage we're in getting the culture of test and evaluation to use STAT. So do I change the slides myself? Let's see. Okay, that's the pointer. How do I use this?
Down arrow. Just on the keyboard with the down arrow.
Okay, in keyboard. So I will stay in front of the keyboard. All right.
Green arrow on the clicker.
Okay. No, I'll stay in front of the keyboard. All right. So many programs don't have in-house STAT expertise. Okay. So we're often a external contact brought in to help an existing program in its progress. Other times, we may be in the organization that's doing the project, but they are not used to incorporating STAT yet, and we're not always in the right place or with all the connections that we need there. So this brings up some things that I think are characteristic communication challenges. Okay. And they involve being late to the party, okay, having a different vocabulary where you each know the same words, but they mean something different to you, and that doesn't always come across. Then there's communication of the value. And I'm also going to talk about this in terms of communication beyond compliance. We don't often run into a closed door anymore where they'll say, sorry, we don't want your help. The message is coming from the top more that, yeah, this does great things and we want to use it. But the people we're working with often don't understand exactly where the value is coming from, and sometimes it's easier for them to just say, okay, yeah, do what you need to do and we'll help. And sometimes that feels like it's enough, but it really puts you in a precarious position in terms of being able to make the necessary impacts to help the program. And last one is indirect contact. Sometimes we'll have like a limited point of contact on the program, and then we end up sort of playing telephone for everyone else we need to reach. And that causes some problems too. The specific case for this study was an electronic text transmission system that was designed and implemented before the internet. Now, it's used to deliver critical, time-sensitive, and high-security orders for a system. The objective is to update the system with modern technology and security protocols. But we're not replacing the system with a modern system that has known performance. It's going to interact with some things that do need to be tested. So first problem we ran into is we're, of course, late to the party. There are literally thousands of requirements. They were written some time ago. They're set in stone, and we need to test them as best as they can be tested as written. Most of them seem deterministic. A lot of them very clearly are. There's either an access panel there or there isn't. We don't need a randomized test to know that. And some of them are clearly stochastic. There's going to be different responses, different times for message delivery. Others we weren't quite sure of because we didn't have enough understanding of the system. But since we're in a position where we're external and helping a program, we're actually helping multiple programs. And we actually didn't have time. It wouldn't have been feasible for us to pour through all the thousands of requirements and ask questions about half of them to see whether they were what we thought they were. So we were able to collaborate well with the team we were helping And they didn't really know stat to know what needs stat testing, but we were able to pretty quickly communicate not everything does and give a good idea. And since they were much more familiar with the system, they were able to, in a much more reasonable time, pick out the ones that they thought were relevant to our test concerns. And then it was much more efficient for us to go over those and see where we agree, and maybe on a few others that we could pick out that we suspected based on other categorizations. It was much more efficient for us to just resolve our differences there rather than trying to start with a position of expertise looking at everything. So for the deterministic requirements, there are interactions that can be important in deterministic systems too. And it's often going to be impossible to test every possible combination. So covering arrays end up being an important way to adjust this, or to account for this. Okay. Yet the importance of interactions in deterministic systems isn't always easy to communicate. Okay. So it's really nice to have someone that we would call a stat champion on the program. Someone who doesn't necessarily know how to implement stat methods, but recognizes their value and has a good idea of where it's most useful to reach out for help proactively. Right? Over several months, we did manage to build up a stat champion and convey the importance of covering arrays. And unfortunately, turnover happens, and hiccups happen. And I'm sure that person is doing great things for the program they're now on, helping to include stat for more rigorous testing. But we did sorely miss them for a time after they were gone. This person was the only one who really had the covering arrays in the presence of their mind and really knew why they were valuable. In their absence, we didn't have enough time to have the in-depth conversations with the rest of the program team to keep those in awareness and in the planning, and those were left behind. Okay. This is one of the hiccups of communication for the position we have to work from. Okay. But just because we can't do everything doesn't mean that we can't help the program. A lot of value can still be added in the stochastic requirements for the tests. Okay. So we had a number of those, and they were written pretty much without any consideration for the ability to test. Okay. They were written without stat awareness. This is another one of the late to the party. So one of them was less than 1 in half a billion character errors, I'd say. Or corrective maintenance is to take less than 20 minutes. Or near 100%, I think it was 99.9% confidence of message transmission in less than 18 seconds. So let's take a look at this. Less than 1 in 500 million character errors. Let's say there can be up to 350 characters in a message, and we can send 3 per minute. It takes literally decades to test that, to say that it meets the requirements. Now, you might be able to say it fails much faster than that, but that's not what we're expecting when we're testing the system. Okay. So the person the people who helped write this requirement may have had some awareness of stat principles in testing, in that they may have known that it is numerically impossible to show that a system is perfect, and just picked something really, really reliable, but still not testable in a practical sense. Okay. Also, how was this number chosen? Was this number chosen for practical consequence? That seems unlikely, because far less strict requirements could see less than 1 character error in a decade. But again, we're not experts on the system, so we can't say that for sure. But we do know that this is not rigorously testable. Corrective maintenance to be done in less than 20 minutes is also difficult. How do we characterize it to know that we're testing in all of the corrective maintenance space in the complex system? This was one that we didn't have the time or resources to really do. So we focused more on the reliability of transmission time. And there was 99.9% confidence that the message be delivered on time. Well, is that statistical confidence? Most likely not. It sounded more like engineering confidence for reliability, perhaps a tolerance interval. Okay. So this was a good sort of a mentoring opportunity for confidence and what it means from different perspectives. None of the requirements were written in terms of considering statistical confidence or let alone power. How certain do we need to be? So we were to take the requirements and then add information as seemed reasonable to us and the subject matter experts so that we could have something testable. There were 2 factors for message type that resulted in 4 categories. Now these weren't expected to influence the transmission time, but they had different requirements, so it was still a meaningful distinction. So like character reliability, now it was expected by people on the program that the transmission time confidence would not be feasible to test. How do you test for less than 1 in 1,000 failures with only a couple hundred data points? Okay. So this was an unanticipated opportunity to really show the value of stat and bring that value into the awareness of that test culture. Okay. So since testing would likely be restricted to hundreds of runs, maybe we won't be able to do this one either. It's like, what can we test? However, unlike character reliability, transmission time can be looked at from a quantitative, like continuous numeric point of view. And this gives a couple other avenues for possible conclusions within our resources. If within a couple hundred data points we can say that it follows a certain distribution, and that distribution has an acceptable failure rate or tolerance interval, then we can say we have rigorous statistical support for that. Okay? And there are non-parametric methods as well, such as Chebyshev's inequality. If any of you are familiar with that, it sets an outer bound for how far away a certain proportion of the population can be from the mean, regardless of distribution. Now again, we have to be flexible because there are changes in scope, further turnover. We're now working with different people again. And we now are only going to be testing the shortcomings of the contractor testing as opposed to verifying their results. Okay, so reduced resources, and we have to change what we're planning for. But we don't actually know what we're planning for because we don't know what the contractor tests are. Okay? And StatCOE, our organization, had no contact on the contractor team. We didn't even know the name of anyone who was on the contractor team to reach out. So we had to work through our primary contact on the government side, who wasn't very familiar with stat, to then talk to someone else who probably wasn't very familiar with stat on the contractor side, who would then talk to the people who actually had the data. And then we needed enough information from that to know what we would have to plan for. This game of telephone, especially not in real time, does tend to slow things down, but we were eventually able to get across that we didn't need the final report with interpretations that they could be held accountable for. We didn't need that, which is good because it probably wouldn't be ready until after we needed our test plans ready. We just needed the raw data, and from that we could know what the shortcomings would be and what we need to test for. Okay. So here's an example of what the contractor test may have been like. Let's say 50 observations, blocks of 10. It was not randomized. It was 2 people, each with a stopwatch. They synchronize their stopwatch. They look at the time when they send. The other person looks at the time when they receive. Okay? Apparently, we couldn't use any digital timestamps. And then what they did would they did say message type A from source 1, do 10 of those. Okay. Message type A from source 2, do 10 of those. All right, now we'll switch the operator on the receiving end. Message type B, source 1, do 10 of those, and message type B, source 2, do 10 of those. Well, okay, I mean, there's going to be some confounding there, in addition to the lack of randomization. So what can we do with this? There are things we can still do with it. Also, the time was recorded to the second. Was this the nearest second? Did they round down to truncate it? Did they round it up? Or was it however the operator felt at the time? Maybe they typically truncated it, but the operator one time saw 5.98. I mean, it'd really be more accurate to put 6, so I'll put 6 this time. Okay. So what can we do without randomization and with aliased factors and blocks? We might have very limited ability to attribute effects, but we might still be able to say when there is no effect. Okay? So there was no difference between message categories, especially at this resolution. Okay? So we were able to analyze it as a single distribution, which would give us more power for determining whether or not the requirements were met in the most strict case. We found the data was very tightly grouped, far from the threshold. The actual variability was hard to determine because in a block of 10, we would have 9 identical values and the 10th off by 1. So we lost pretty much all of the distributional shape. Okay. Most of the variability was lost to the truncation. So that could be 0.02 seconds variation. It could be almost 2 seconds variation. Even so, it was borderline for Chebyshev's inequality to be sufficient to say that the requirement was being met everywhere, according to that contractor testing. And that was really exciting because I never thought I'd get to use Chebyshev's inequality in a non-academic setting. So it turns out we couldn't conclusively use Chebyshev's inequality. However, that's also a worst-case scenario for the worst-case distribution. We didn't see any outliers or real skew. So we had pretty strong emotional confidence that it was a distribution that would have given statistical confidence. But how do we quantify that? Is that good enough? Possibly up to program's risk tolerance. Fortunately, we didn't have to leave it there. There was government testing to follow up on the shortcomings of contractor testing. Now, we had lost our stat champion because we only had one. But we still had our toe in the door. Okay? We weren't able to influence what runs were being made or in what order, but they did have some things they needed to test for the deterministic requirements that hadn't been covered. And this involved sending messages, so why not just record those times anyway and use them? Okay? Also, we're using stopwatches that give the 100th of a second. Why not just, write that down too? We understand most of that variability is going to be human response time. But if we can say that the requirements are being met with that bias and extra variability, then they would certainly be met without it. Okay. So we were able to get times that were recorded to 100th of a second. I already said most of this. So even after all this time, we'd been talking about what tests we could do. It was still in the minds of the real experienced test engineers that it was impossible to test for less than 1 in 1,000 failures without at least 1,000 test points. So it turns out seeing is believing. Okay? At this point, we did have compliance and not much else. Maybe they were hoping we could add something, but didn't really see where it could come into play. Okay? But being there regularly and participating regularly, early, and often got us in the door to be able to get enough to make a difference. Okay. So this is data works. I figured I probably should show some data at some point. So here it is. And we got a sample that we thought log normal would probably be a decent fit. Turns out it was the best fit, but not a great one. Okay. In government testing, we also saw outliers, which had not been there in the contractor testing. We also noticed that observations had been made in triplets. They would send from one terminal to 3 terminals simultaneously and measure it separately. So it's not randomized with limited independence, but there's still maybe things we can do. Okay. Turns out there appeared to be 2 types of outliers. Type alpha, I'll say, is where one receiving terminal was severely delayed, but the other 2 received it in normal time. And then type beta, where all the receiving terminals were moderately delayed, but all really still close to each other with about the same variability between them that they would normally have. Aside from the outliers, the observed variance was much less than our worst case scenario from the truncated values. They were very good with their stopwatches. Okay? And also, aside from the outliers, there did not appear to be any practical difference in distribution between the 4 categories. So we would maybe be able to use that information to expand our understanding of the distribution for any one category. Okay? Now, there were some observational patterns. We can't attribute causal effects without randomization, but it was statistically significant in correlation that the type alpha outliers only existed from transmission source 2, and the type beta outliers were only present in message type B. So type A messages from source 1 that had some of the strictest requirements were also free from outliers. So we're able to say that there was observational statistical support that the requirements were being met even in the strictest place, and that the outlier rates weren't common enough to violate the requirements for some others. So we were able to give them a more powerful conclusion than they would have gotten otherwise. If they wanted rigorous statistical support, though, they would have to follow up with a randomized experiment. Okay. I'm running a bit short on time, so I will skip a bit to the point here. In that you want to be involved early and often. Okay. That gives you a foot in the door for people to start understanding and for you to keep up with things even if they don't realize that they want to bring you along. Because people are going to reach out to you to help lighten their load, to give additional value if they recognize it. They're not going to increase their load to bring you on if they don't see that value. Okay? So that's where communication beyond compliance is important, so that they bring you along with the unexpected turns and bumps in the road, so that you can bring more value to the project. And any value you bring opens the door for greater inclusion later. And that's what really changes the culture over time. It makes it easier every year to do more for people. Okay? You do want to line up expectations. It also isn't great if they think everything you do is magic and you can fix everything. So if they realize you can't do that, it's extra motivation to bring you on early to avoid that situation. And having a resident stat champion is vital, but having more than one is best. And finally, be flexible. There are going to be hiccups. Maybe it doesn't turn out quite as rigorous or in as many directions as you wanted it to be, as it was planned to be. But any benefit is better than no benefit. And again, it changes people's views and incorporates it more in the future. So after seeing what we're able to do, this program has been much more proactive in involving STAT, and it actually has been a pleasure to work with. So I realize this is not a complete set of strategies for overcoming these obstacles, but I hope it helps some of you and any of you who have experience that could give us more tools in these types of situations. It's a conversation I'd be delighted to have. So thank you very much.
We have time for questions. Please go up to the microphone if you have questions, or you're being recorded Zoom right now. Well, I have a question for you. I think this one's on.
Sure.
Yeah, so this microphone's on. So you mentioned the term stat champion a couple times, and very early on I jotted down a note. So how do you find said stat champion?
How do you find the stat champion? Well, when there's already one there, it tends to be pretty clear in the group discussions where you mention something and then someone else on the team picks up the topic and takes it another step further, or asks a good question about it. Often, you do have to develop a stat champion, which tends to happen with the person that you communicate the most with, because they end up seeing most of the reason behind it and the goals from it much more thoroughly than people who are just passing by in the weekly working group meetings. Right? Yeah. So it's something that you cultivate.
I think an important point is that you're looking for one.
Yes.
Deliberately, and I think that's a really powerful, piece of information. And picking up on those cues, I think that's very helpful.
Yeah, and once they understand that value, they have greater rapport within the program and are able to, say with more convincing voices, yeah, we really do want to do this.